For 62 years, the Secret Service kept 9 presidents and their families out of harm's way. But in Dallas in 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald penetrated the protective cocoon. Our program tells the story of the Secret Service during one of the most turbulent and violent eras in American history, when every year seemed to bring more riots, demonstrations, and assassinations. The Secret Service is usually just that, secret. But on our broadcast, former agents talk candidly about those tumultuous years. One was assigned to the Kennedy motorcade in Dallas. Join us now for a rare inside look at the United States Secret Service.
Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy is on a trip to mend political fences in Texas. Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood was assigned to guard Vice President Lyndon Johnson.
We got off the plane. Air Force Two landed first ahead of the president because we had a lot of press people and all that on it. And then when the president's plane arrived, we met and greeted the President and Mrs. Kennedy.
Secret Service agent Clint Hill was responsible for protecting Mrs. Kennedy that day in Dallas.
The motorcade left the airport after a pretty good-sized crowd at the airport. Went on into the city of Dallas, through the streets of Dallas, where there were crowds periodically along the way. It wasn't solid everywhere, but there's apparent, crowds were in. And we got in the downtown section of Dallas. It became much more crowded.
It had been raining earlier that morning in Fort Worth. It cleared up, and it just turned out to look like a nice day, a nice crowd.
And the streets were crowded enough so that the motorcycles were having a difficult time remaining alongside the presidential car on the left-hand side of the street because the driver of the presidential car was keeping the car farther to the left-hand side of the street to keep the president away from the crowd, which presented a problem for me because I was responsible for Mrs. Kennedy, and I had to get up on the back of the car periodically to be closer to her to try to prevent anything from happening because of her proximity to the large number of people on that side of the street. And I had gotten up and down from the car 3 or 4 times.
It was confining, but there was nothing really wrong about it except, the smell of motorcycles and cars.
The Kennedys rode in a lead car with Governor and Mrs. Connolly, followed by the Secret Service follow-up car, then Vice President Johnson's car.
And I was seated in the front seat on the opposite side from the driver, right in front of LBJ.
November 22nd, 1963, Dealey Plaza, Dallas. Secret Service agents are joined by Texas state troopers and Dallas police officers. President Kennedy was seated in his customary spot in the motorcade. Agent Clint Hill was stationed in the follow-up car behind the president. Vice President Johnson was 2 cars back from the president. Agent Rufus Youngblood was seated directly in front of the vice president, while Lee Harvey Oswald waited in his sniper's nest. Agents Hill and Youngblood both believed that Oswald was the lone gunman that day.
And then when we finally arrived in the Dealey Plaza area, the crowds were very sparse. And so I returned to the follow-up car, and we made a left-hand turn, and shortly after we made a left-hand turn, there was an explosion, to my right rear. Sounded either like a gunshot or a firecracker. And I responded by looking to my right, and as I did so, my eyes went across the back of the presidential car. And I saw the president grab at his throat and lurch to the left. And I jumped from the car and ran to the presidential car. Before I got there, he had been shot again in the head. And when I got to the car, Mrs. Kennedy was coming out on the back of the trunk of the car. It appeared to me that she was attempting to retrieve part of his head that had been blown off. I slipped when I first tried to get up on the car, and I had to take 2 or 3 more steps before I finally did get up on the car and helped put her back in her seat and laid across the top of she and the president. We went on to the hospital, and when we got there, pulled into the emergency room, I noticed that the governor, his chest was all covered with blood. I had not realized that he had been hit. And so we had to get him out of the jump seats and onto a stretcher and into the emergency room before we could get the president out of the back seat of the car. And by that time, Mrs. Kennedy wouldn't let go of the president. And I realized that she didn't want anybody to see what was going on because part of his head had been blown off. And so I took my coat off and we placed it over him and put him on the stretcher and rushed him into the emergency room.
As the first shot rang out, Youngblood covered Vice President Johnson.
I turned in my seat and hit him on the shoulder and hollered, "Get down." And then I got back on top of him. We proceeded to the hospital. And I told the president, the vice president, when we were going to the hospital that, well, it is certainly an emergency situation, and I'm going to just stick with you like glue. As soon as we got to the hospital, we started in. And I had the assistance of some of these other agents, and we went into a private room, and I had them pull down all the shades and post an agent at the door, you know. And no one comes in here unless you know who it is and what his reason for being here.
Shortly thereafter, President Kennedy died. Like the rest of America, Rufus Youngblood was asking himself just what was going on.
We didn't know what had happened. We didn't know whether somebody had come around the corner with a machine gun and be shooting. We didn't know whether it was a conspiracy. We didn't know what was happening. So if you don't know, you prepare for everything. And, you know, I told him we should get out of there and get on the plane and get back to Washington and get in the White House. And he said, well, we'll leave here, but we'll wait on the plane for Mrs. Kennedy.
The Secret Service's first priority was to get Lyndon Johnson safely out of town.
I had sent Lim Johns, who was working with me, I had sent him out to line up a car and get a driver that really knows the way and all the secrets and routes and everything. So he went out and he got Chief Curry, the police chief of Dallas. And we got in Chief Curry's car. You know, we killed the sirens, but we did have a motorcycle escort, and we went on back to the airport. And I had told him as soon as we stop and get out, and let's run up the ramp, no delays. And, you know, as soon as we got on the plane, I said, pull down all the shades. And I told him not to sit next to the window.
The Dallas Police Department wanted to hold John Kennedy's body for an autopsy. However, the Kennedy family prevailed, and the casket was soon loaded onto Air Force One.
He talked to Bobby Kennedy, and it was decided to get federal Judge Sarah Hughes to come out and administer the oath. There was a lot of sobs and throats and, you know, lumps in the throat and sobs and all that on the airplane coming back.
That evening, Air Force One arrived back in Washington. President Kennedy's coffin was removed by a hastily arranged honor guard. The president's body was placed in a hearse as Clint Hill assisted Mrs. Kennedy. Then President Johnson, assisted by Rufus Youngblood, deplaned. The new president made his first public statement on the tarmac.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
He went to his office that night. He had an office in the EOB, which was part of the White House complex. But he did not go into the presidential office in the White House. He met people, had people coming and going, wrote some memos and all that stuff.
One of Lyndon Johnson's first presidential decisions was to remain in his own home in Bethesda, Maryland, called the Elms.
And he said, you know, we're not moving into the White House. We're going to go to our house. So I was on the radio a lot, making arrangements and all to have security provided at his residence, the Elms. It was a hectic day. I don't think I got home till about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I didn't break down until then. I got home and I got to talking to Peggy, and man, I almost fell apart.
Even before the night was out, a bond developed between Youngblood and Lyndon Johnson that would continue throughout both men's careers. The days following the death of John F. Kennedy have become an unforgettable part of America's collective memory. As the Secret Service secured the area around the casket of John Kennedy in the Capitol, another bizarre event had transpired in Dallas. Lee Harvey Oswald, in the custody of the Dallas police, was shot while being transferred from one jail to another.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
accused assassin was rushed to Parkland Hospital, where President Kennedy himself had been taken 2 days earlier. It was there that Lee Harvey Oswald died. The Kennedy State funeral required the services of every Secret Service agent and officer available. Never before had the service been responsible for such a mammoth event, but these were extraordinary circumstances. In addition to their usual protective function, they would be responsible for the 94 heads of state in attendance. While everything proceeded exactly as planned, for the Secret Service, it was a time of pure emotion for everyone involved.
You know, I've been in motorcades all over the world, seen crowds, all different kind of crowds and all that, but that was eerie. Man, when you can hear people crying when you know, going down the street, and you see grown men, agents out there with tears, things like that. It was very emotional, and I don't want to go any further.
Mrs. John F. Kennedy accompanies Secret Service agent Clinton J. Hill and his family to ceremonies in Washington. Secretary of the Treasury Douglas Dillon acts for the nation as he commends Mr. Hill for his heroism during those tragic moments in Dallas when President Kennedy was assassinated. The agent is presented with the Treasury's gold medal. During those horrible moments in Dallas, he jumped onto the president's car to shield the president and his wife. The next day, in the White House Rose Garden, President Johnson cites another Secret Service hero. He is Rufus Youngblood, who also distinguished himself in Dallas. He was riding in Mr. Johnson's car when the shooting began. He leaped into the back seat, pushed the Vice President to the floor, and shielded him with his own body. He acted in the fine traditions of the Secret Service that draws high praise from the President.
There is no more heroic act than offering your life to save another. And in that awful moment of confusion, when all about him were losing their heads, Rufus Youngblood never lost his.
Clinton Hill and Rufus Youngblood, two men who did not hesitate to offer their own lives in protecting the nation's leaders. They wrote a bright page in the dark chapter that was Dallas.
I want to take this opportunity to express my appreciation for the hundreds of thousands of messages, nearly 800,000 in all, which my children and I have received over the past few weeks. The knowledge of the affection in which my husband was held by all of you has sustained me, and the warmth of these tributes is something I shall never forget. Whenever I can bear to, I read them. All his bright light gone from the world. All of you who have written to me know how much we all loved him, and that he returned that love in full measure. It is my greatest wish that all of these letters be acknowledged. They will be, but it will take a long time to do so. But I know you will understand. Each and every message is to be treasured, not only for my children, but so that future generations will know how much our country and people in other nations thought of him.
After the assassination, President Johnson permitted Mrs. Kennedy and the children to remain in the White House for a period of time, so that the Johnsons did not move into the White House right after the assassination. Then Mrs. Kennedy and the children were offered the residence of Averill Harriman in Georgetown to go to, and they moved there and stayed there for a period of time, and then Mrs. Kennedy purchased a home in Georgetown, not too far from the Harriman residence. She found that it was just too intrusive. There were tour buses going by the house, and she just didn't want the children to have to put up with that, and so she decided that she was going to move to New York. And she went to New York. We stayed at the Carlisle Hotel until she found a place at 1040 Fifth Avenue, and she moved into that residence, which is across the street from Central Park in New York, and she remained there the rest of her life.
The days after the assassination of John Kennedy were the darkest ever for the Secret Service. Since being officially charged with presidential protection, no one had ever been harmed. Now, the most beloved American leader in a generation was dead. Shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson announced the formation of a blue ribbon panel to investigate the incident. Supreme Court Justice Cyril Warren was named to head the Commission of 13. Among the panelists was a future president, Michigan Congressman Gerald Ford.
It was grim. It was grim that whole year, 63, 64. We did not know what the Warren Commission was going to do. And I've often felt that it was the agents like Jim Rowley and Rufus Youngblood and Clint himself and Win Lawson, just their dignity about this thing and their expertise and their professionalism that helped save it for us. I mean, it could have easily been transferred to another agency. It was a very difficult period, and one that we never got over. I mean, there's only one agent, Bill Livingood, now that was even in the Secret Service when it happened. We have a whole generation that's passed into retirement, but they haven't forgotten it either.
After 11 months of investigation, the Warren Commission delivered its findings to the president. It recommended that the Secret Service continue to protect the president and establish 2 new divisions.
The Intelligence Division is responsible for receiving, analyzing, coordinating information that may have impact on the protection of any of our protectees or any of the installations that we're responsible for protecting. So we receive the information, we will refer it out for investigation if it's merited, or we will refer it to other law enforcement agencies if that's appropriate.
In response to criticisms regarding the lack of information sharing with the FBI, the Warren Commission recommended the establishment of a special liaison division within the service.
The liaison division is an investigative arm of the Intelligence Division. Our responsibility is to ensure that the intelligence criteria is disseminated to the different contexts that we do business with. We maintain liaison with 154 embassies. We also liaison with roughly 90 to 95 government agencies and divisions inside those agencies.
One specific change made in the wake of Dallas was a new set of criteria for presidential automobiles. President Kennedy was riding in a Secret Service parade car codenamed 100X when he was shot. This car started out as a stock 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible.
It was a custom-built car, again a stretch design done by Hessen-Eisenhardt, which was a specialty builder in Cincinnati. And the car was sent to them and they stretched it. It had a whole array of portable different roofs that could be put on the car, so you could have a situation that was similar to the bubble top with Eisenhower, or a fully enclosed car, or as it was in Dallas in '63, it could be a completely open car. It was not, however, an armored vehicle prior to Dallas. The Secret Service took the car, and by mid-December, it was at Hessen-Eisenhardt, back at Hessen-Eisenhardt in Cincinnati. And they, a committee of people got together to decide what to do, And they even contemplated getting a whole new presidential limousine, finally decided that the best thing to do would be to modify that car, and they resulted in a very thorough rebuilding of that automobile. It was armored, it was a permanent top with bulletproof glass, and of course a bulletproof steel top was put on it. That top cannot be removed. The engine was updated and made more powerful to handle the extra weight. The result was that the car came out weighing about a ton more than it did before the assassination. So it was thoroughly gone over. An updated front end was put on it for 1963. The color was changed from the midnight blue to black. And all of that is one reason that people will look at that car now and they'll say, well, that's not the Kennedy car. Well, it doesn't look like it did in Dallas because it's been significantly modified.
The 100X was returned to White House service in late 1964 and remained in use until its retirement in 1978. Today, it resides at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, as part of its presidential automobiles exhibit. Special legislation was passed after the death of John Kennedy to provide Secret Service protection for his widow and children, something that had never been done before.
I was with her in both Washington and when she moved to New York. We formed a special unit to provide protection for she and the children because a special law had been passed that provided she and the children with protection until the children reached the age of 16.
It came to the attention of President Johnson that former President Harry Truman and his wife Bess were becoming increasingly frail and in need of assistance. In 1965, he spearheaded legislation that provided Secret Service protection for former presidents and their wives. Clint Hill returned to the White House in 1965, just as the U.S. involvement in Vietnam was increasing.
Because of the Vietnam War, we had some problems with demonstrators, and not only in the United States, we had some problems with demonstrators overseas, specifically in Australia.
We had made a trip to Sydney, and as the motorcade was going down the street, crowd on either side, good coverage with agents and police, but some youngster, he threw paint bombs at the car. And the paint was red paint and green paint, which were the colors of the, I think, North Vietnam. The paint splashed on the car, and it splashed in my face and in Lem John's face, and all over us, in fact. But the paint got in our eyes, and we had to go to the hospital. The car wasn't damaged. I mean, they had to repaint it that night. They had to put it in and actually take the old paint off, do a complete paint job of the car on the outside. Next day, you couldn't tell it.
In April of 1968, the Reverend Martin Luther King was gunned down in Memphis, Tennessee. This senseless, brutal act triggered a violent chain reaction in cities across the country, including Washington, D.C.
We had a week of riots, and for a day or two, the government was virtually shut down, and the entire District of Columbia was under martial law, occupied by the U.S. Army. The White House and the EOB was entirely lined with soldiers with bayonets on the ready, standing shoulder to shoulder all the way around.
I recall President Johnson wanting to view it from a helicopter. He wanted to view the Washington, D.C. area from a helicopter because he wanted to see the city burning, you know, see what was really happening out there. And we had a hard time discouraging him from doing that.
At the beginning of 1968, it seemed that Lyndon Johnson was sure to get the Democratic presidential nomination that year. However, anti-war demonstrations against the president were continuing nonstop. Security was so difficult to maintain at public events that the Secret Service recommended that the president speak only at military bases or other government installations. In early 1968, Senator Eugene McCarthy announced that he would challenge LBJ for the Democratic presidential nomination as a peace candidate. On March 12th, McCarthy nearly beat Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. The race was now wide open. Into the vacuum stepped Robert F. Kennedy. Long considered a wild card, Kennedy announced his candidacy 4 days after the New Hampshire primary.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
LBJ had seen enough.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to speak to you of peace in Vietnam and Southeast Asia.
In a nationally televised speech about Vietnam 2 weeks later, Johnson tacked on a surprise ending.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The Secret Service did not protect presidential candidates at this time. The only exception was Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who entered the race soon after the president's withdrawal. However, the Secret Service was monitoring the activities of each candidate and was especially concerned about Senator Kennedy. Rufus Youngblood remembers the Kennedy dilemma.
Efforts had been made by the Secret Service to get candidate protection, but it wasn't just the Secret Service wanting to reach out and grab more responsibility. There were people in Congress and in the bureaucracy or administration. There were other people that wanted this to come about because we were having, demonstrations. There was a lot of unrest.
As the primary season played out, it became apparent that Richard Nixon would win the Republican nomination. The Democrats, however, were far from unanimous in their candidate preference. Humphrey, Kennedy, and McCarthy battled it out from state to state, and no clear winner broke from the pack. The last major primary election was to be held in California on June 4th. Each of the men tirelessly crisscrossed the state in search of support. With over 200 delegates at stake, the winner here would probably be the party's candidate in November. The California primary race in 1968 brought out the best in Robert Kennedy as a candidate. But for all the love that was evident on the campaign trail, there was an undercurrent of fear as well. Senator Kennedy assembled his own protective detail. Privately, however, the Secret Service had warned the Kennedy campaign that there were problems with their security. The warnings went unheeded.
Well, let me just say this, that his security was inadequate. I mean, the amount of coverage, I'm not saying anything wrong with what Rosie Greer did or anyone else. I mean, it wasn't that. It was just that, he didn't have adequate security. But at the time, the Secret Service was not charged with protected candidates.
Midnight, June 5th, Robert F. Kennedy claims victory in the California primary from the Ambassador Hotel ballroom.
And I hope that we have as good fortune in our campaign.
June 5th, 1968, the Ambassador Hotel, Los Angeles. There was no Secret Service protection. Senator Kennedy leaves the ballroom through a rear service door. Sirhan Sirhan waits as the candidate's entourage approaches. Kennedy walks through the hotel kitchen where shots suddenly ring out. Bobby Kennedy was shot in the head at close range. Sirhan Sirhan was arrested at the scene. Throughout the night, Kennedy lingered. Then, early the next morning, he died. President Johnson immediately authorized Secret Service protection for all presidential candidates as the Kennedys prepared once again for a family funeral. Robert Kennedy's body was flown back to New York City for a requiem mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. A special funeral train carried him from New York to Washington. The route was packed with thousands of mourners. Three days later, Congress passed the legislation necessary to formalize the president's order. Since that day, every major presidential candidate and their wives have received Secret Service protection. After a respectful time, the presidential candidates went back to work. But the sudden death of Senator Kennedy left a tremendous void that was difficult to fill. The Republicans met in Miami and went on to nominate Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew at a convention that was calm and orderly. There would be no such luck when the Democrats convened in Chicago on August 26th.
I was in Chicago. I was agent in charge, and we did not know if President Johnson was going to attend the convention. And I was at the LBJ Ranch and with the president. And so I went to Chicago and took some additional people with me, just in case he decided to fly into Chicago and attend the convention and address the convention. I had stayed in the Hilton Hotel, which is across the street from the park in which the demonstrations were being held. And tear gas was pretty thick in that part of the city. You couldn't breathe. It was just, it was terrible. The service had a number of protectees there in 1968 because we were responsible for the candidates. The Chicago Police Department was out in force because there were all kinds of threats, and every man that was available was being utilized to the fullest extent possible.
The police beat everybody they could catch because it was like a medieval war down there with nightsticks and mace.
To the credit of the Secret Service, not one protectee was harmed during the four-day melee that broke out in the streets of Chicago.
Now, from just a sheer violent perspective, what we had to worry about was not only the crowds, which many of them wanted to turn the cars over and burn them up, throw their children in front of cars to stop them. I mean, we've forgotten that, how really dirty and nasty. Throwing styrofoam balls with razor blades in them. Using oven cleaner on the police and the agents. I mean, these kind of things get internalized also. And a real intense anger and hatred of this kind of behavior. It was a terrible period. But we had gone through in 66, in 67, in 68 when Martin Luther King was killed. Here in Washington, we had a curfew. We had the military district of Washington. Armed troops. We had a lot of stuff in the air. You had not only Martin Luther King killed, you had Robert Kennedy killed. It set the tone for that whole year. There was nothing good about that year. You had hundreds of Americans being killed every week in the Tet Offensive in late January. And it was really almost the culminating year for the Secret Service. It was a period of extreme violence where blood was in the air, anger, hatred. And we got caught up in it. It took me 20 years to really get over that.
69 opened with the inauguration of Richard M. Nixon as the 37th President of the United States. He faced great challenges, a war in Vietnam, racial division, youth unrest, and a changing moral climate at home.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend
The Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me
As
God.
Richard Nixon took the oath of office in January 1969, the Secret Service was keeping a watchful eye on the crowd. Anti-war demonstrators had threatened to disrupt the inaugural ceremonies, and earlier that day, the president-elect's car had been pelted with rocks. Even with a new president, demonstrations against the Vietnam War persisted in Washington and continued to pose problems for the Secret Service. To meet the increased security demands, the Uniform Division of the Secret Service was expanded and reorganized in 1970.
We only had 205 White House police officers at the White House, strictly for the protection of the perimeter of the White House and some parts of the interior of the White House and the whole executive office building. Congress authorized us to go from a level of 205 officers to 850 officers. So we had recruit teams traveling all over the United States to get the proper applicants who qualified for the Uniform Division. At that time, Congress changed the name from White House Police to the Executive Protective Service.
For the first time, uniformed officers traveled outside of Washington, D.C., and assisted with security at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. 1972 was the first year that the Secret Service was responsible for protecting all presidential candidates on a full-time basis. President Nixon had no serious challenger for his party's nomination. However, the Democrats fielded a wide assortment of candidates. They included former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, South Dakota Senator George McGovern, and Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman to run for president. But the biggest question mark in 1972 was Alabama Governor George Wallace, who came back to the Democratic Party after running as a third-party independent in 1968. Secret Service agent Nick Zarvos was assigned to protect George Wallace in both of his presidential bids.
In 1972, he was again a candidate, and Secret Service was assigned to protect him, and we worked very closely with the Alabama State Troopers.
Agent Zarvos' dedication and professionalism while on the campaign trail with George Wallace would nearly cost him his life.
After the Warren Commission report on the Kennedy assassination, the Secret Service embarked on a decade of modernization and expansion, from 360 agents to 1,200, from an annual budget of $7.5 million to one of $63 million. But soon after this expansion came 3 more assassination attempts, 2 on President Ford in September 1975 and 1 on President Reagan in 1981. On our next program, President Ford talks about those attempts on his life, and James Brady, the Reagan press secretary, recalls taking a bullet meant for his boss. The United States Secret Service has been protecting our presidents and their families since 1901, a span of 17 presidents. Of the 17, they've lost 1 and almost lost 2 others. Our program focuses on the Secret Service and the 2 they almost lost. Former President Gerald Ford tells about being a target twice within 17 days in September 1975. We'll also hear from the agent who probably saved his life. And Ronald Reagan's press secretary, James Brady, recalls the day in 1981 when a would-be assassin almost killed Reagan, but wounded Brady instead. Join us now as the History Channel presents a rare inside look at the mission and strategy of the Secret Service.
Following the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, the Secret Service began protecting presidential candidates. Among 1972 presidential hopefuls was Alabama Governor George Wallace. From the beginning, Wallace had always been two things, a fighter and a politician. He paid his way through law school by boxing professionally. In 1962, Wallace was elected governor of Alabama by promoting segregation against the rising national tide of the civil rights movement. When the federal government tried to integrate the University of Alabama by force, Governor Wallace made the event a spectacle, standing in the doorway to prevent the Deputy Attorney General from entering. Wallace became a national figure for segregationists. In 1968, Wallace became the most successful independent presidential candidate in modern history, winning 5 states and 13% of the national vote. By 1972, Wallace was ready to run again.
In 1972, he was again a candidate, and Secret Service was assigned to protect him, and we worked very closely with the Alabama State Troopers.
Among the agents assigned to George Wallace was Nick Zarvos, who took a bullet in the throat while protecting the governor. He described the enthusiastic crowds they encountered on the campaign trail.
They would become so exuberant, we thought at times somebody would actually pull him off the stage. I always would reach under his suit jacket and grab his belt and the trousers to make sure he was not pulled into the crowd. There were many threats on his life, and being controversial, there were security had to be beefed up. We worked the governor extremely close. I was always directly in back of him. Of all the people I'd been with, I thought we worked him as closely as almost humanly possible, as closely as anyone that I had ever protected.
May 15th, 1972. The Laurel Shopping Center, Laurel, Maryland. Secret Service agents were joined by Alabama and Maryland State Police. Governor Wallace was eager to shake the hands of his enthusiastic audience. Agent Nick Zarvos was positioned directly behind the governor. Arthur Bremer waited patiently for the target he had been stalking. There had been ugly incidents at a speech earlier in the day in Wheaton, but Wallace nevertheless was in high spirits. In the crowd as Wallace spoke was a deeply disturbed 21-year-old man named Arthur Bremer. Bremer had been stalking President Richard Nixon, but had been deterred from attacking him by Nixon's large Secret Service contingent. Instead, Bremer focused on George Wallace. Bremer had written in his diary, "I have to kill someone. I am one sick assassin." Agent Zarvos felt that the site was secure for Wallace as long as Wallace stayed on the platform.
The governor was advised that he shouldn't shake hands to give his speech and then head right back to the motorcade and exit the area. He gave his speech and he planned on, I think, going back directly to the motorcade. He exited off the podium, and some of his campaign workers who were behind the ropes and near the podium area started chanting, you know, "George, George, please come shake hands." He took his jacket off and gave it to one of his staff people and proceeded to go over and shake hands with some of the staff workers, and then proceeded to work to his right and shake some of the crowd's hands, people who were behind the rope. He went down to his right. At that moment, Arthur Bremer who was standing in the second row apparently came over the shoulder of a man standing from me and got off about 5 shots in under 2 seconds and shot the governor, myself. I heard the first gunshot. I was looking a little to the left. When I heard the second or third gunshot, I started moving my head to the right, and at the same instant, I felt a burning sensation in my neck and knew that I'd been hit.
George Wallace was alive but could not move. The shots fired through him had ripped apart his abdomen and spine, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. He survived the shooting, but at a horrible price. His presidential hopes were shattered. Agent Zarvos recovered from his neck wound, but was left disabled. In a crowd, shaking hands, the most natural place for a politician, is also the most dangerous, as Gerald Ford would learn 3 years later. For the Secret Service, things were pretty quiet on the presidential protection front in the summer of 1972 when compared to the tumultuous events of the past decade. It's understandable that a third-rate burglary at the Democratic National Committee offices in the Watergate office building could almost become lost in the other news of the day. However, within months, the nature of the Watergate scandal was becoming apparent, and the pressure began to mount on the White House. As Watergate began to unfold before the American public in 1973, a separate scandal was uncovered involving Vice President Spiro Agnew, who resigned on October 10th. Faced with naming a new vice president, Richard Nixon chose the well-respected Michigan Congressman Gerald Ford, who was the minority leader of the House of Representatives. Congress enthusiastically endorsed one of their own, and Mr. Ford easily became the first non-elected vice president of the United States. By the summer of 1974, the Watergate cover-up came to a head. Faced with impeachment, President Nixon decided to resign. At noon on August 9th, 1974, Gerald Ford took the oath of office and became the 38th President of the United States and the first non-elected one. President Ford, as part of his healing process, made every effort to get out of Washington to meet the public. The Secret Service was right there with him. September 5th, 1975, the California State Capitol in Sacramento, under the protection of the Secret Service. President Ford was briskly walking to the State Capitol building. Agent Larry Boondorf was in his customary position over the president's shoulder. Following the two men was Lynette Squeaky Fromm.
I had gone to Sacramento to make a speech before a California Chamber of Commerce. After my speech, I walked over to the state capitol just to pay a courtesy call upon Governor Jerry Brown.
Secret Service agent Larry Boondorf was protecting Ford during that walk.
I mean, press were everywhere and staff were running around and everybody was trying to get together, so it was a lot of people. So we were working very close to the president with our circle.
There were people lined up on the path on either side, and I was shaking hands with the various people who wanted to say hello and shake hands.
As we started walking down the park, we walked down a sidewalk area and grass on both sides, and people started to line up along the walkway. There was no rope line as such, because it was a spontaneous type thing. As we were walking, I took a position right at his left shoulder. If you were facing the crowd, I'd be at his left shoulder moving right. And he was shaking hands, and I was doing what I was trained to do as far as making sure that nobody held on too long and helping break hands away. And so my focus was really on his hands.
And as we moved toward the Capitol, I noticed a lady in a very bright red dress who kept moving slowly with me, but not putting her hand out to shake my hand. And as we got closer and closer to the steps of the state capitol, I went to shake a hand, and here was a hand that had a gun in it, and obviously the person was about to pull the trigger.
All of a sudden, I see this hand coming up very low with an object in it. And not really thinking about it, I just stepped in front of him to stop it, because it, coming the way it was, it could have struck him in some way, but in any case, I stepped out. The minute I hit that weapon, I mean, I knew it was a gun. Why I didn't say gun, I don't know, but I yelled out 45 and pulled the gun out of her hand. I had a hold of 2 or 3 of her fingers in my left hand and the gun in my right hand. I remember pulling the gun into my chest, and now I'm pushing her away from the president. And she's fighting me, and we're both struggling through the crowd. The crowd is kind of opening up, but they don't know what's going on, really. They see a guy holding a gun in his hand and taking this little girl back out of the crowd. The rest of the agents did exactly what they should be doing. They covered the president and evacuated. As I was pushing her back through the crowd, she finally turned to kind of run, and I was able to pull her arm back and dropped her on the ground. At that time, a police officer came in to assist me. We were able to handcuff her. I turned the weapon over to another agent and went back to work.
I went to Jerry Brown's office, walked in, shook hands. I never mentioned the incident. His staff had not told him about it. So we talked for 15 or 20 minutes, and I walked out. He was later, of course, informed about what happened, but those things take place, and that's one of the perils we found as an occupant of the White House.
I had no hesitation to do what I had to do. You never think of losing, see? You only think of winning. You don't think, well, you know, if I do this, it might cost my life. That's not what you think about. You think, you know, I can successfully do this. That's what I'm trained to do, and it will work.
The gun-wielding young woman in Sacramento was Lynette Fromm, known to her friends as Squeaky. She had a history of mental problems and was a member of the Charles Manson clan. After a speedy trial, she was convicted and sentenced to prison.
A lot of things go on in your mind afterwards about what might have happened. Initially, you make a move much like an athlete makes a move. If you were playing basketball and a guy moved left, you'd move left, and move right, you'd move right. Things become automatic in our training. So when something like that occurs, you do it.
Also serving time in a California prison was Sarah Jane Moore. While she and Squeaky Fromm came from different backgrounds, they committed the same crime in the same state. On September 22nd, 1975, just 17 days after the assassination attempt in Sacramento, President Ford returned to California to deliver a speech in San Francisco. September 22nd, 1975. The St. Francis Hotel, San Francisco, under the protection of the Secret Service. President Ford was entering his car outside the St. Francis Hotel. Across the street, Sarah Jane Moore was taking aim on the president.
So I flew up, made the speech, and walked out of the St. Francis Hotel, and all of a sudden, as I was about to get into the limousine, there was this shot, which missed me by a relatively narrow margin.
Sarah Jane Moore had positioned herself in the crowd across the street from the hotel. Her location was perfect for a clean shot at the president. Fortunately, a civilian bystander, George Sipple, grabbed at the gun, causing the bullet to miss its intended mark.
The Secret Service agent slammed me into the limousine, and we took off for San Francisco Airport. Nobody went from the St. Francis Hotel to that airport faster than I did.
Sarah Jane Moore was apprehended without much difficulty. Unlike Squeaky Fromm, Moore was no stranger to the Secret Service. She had been an informer for the FBI and considered a potential presidential assassin because of her mental instability. In fact, 2 days before the shooting, she had been interviewed by Secret Service agents. They decided at the time that she was not a threat to the president. After the incident, President Ford got to break the news to First Lady Betty Ford aboard Air Force One.
Well, Betty arrived. She saw all these motorcycles around Air Force One. She didn't understand what had happened. They couldn't communicate because of all the confusion. So she walks up the gangplank to get on Air Force One, walks into where we are sitting, relaxing, and she says, well, how did they treat you in San Francisco?
In the second month of his presidency, Ronald Reagan gives a speech to a labor group at the Washington Hilton Hotel and prepares to leave through a side door. Outside that door waits John Warnock Hinckley, a young loner from Colorado with an obsession for a movie star and a .22 caliber handgun. March 30th, 1981, the Washington Hilton, Washington, D.C. Secret Service agents are joined by D.C. police officers. President Reagan is on a routine trip in Washington, D.C. Agent Parr is positioned to the right of the president, and Agent McCarthy to the left of Mr. Reagan. D.C. police officer Delahanty is keeping the press corps at bay. President Reagan is accompanied by Press Secretary James Brady and Deputy Chief of Staff Michael Deaver. Within the ranks of the press corps is John Hinckley. The Secret Service has only to get Reagan the 10 steps from the side door of the hotel to his limousine. Agent Jerry Parr has no idea that in performing that routine move, he and Agent Tim McCarthy will become heroes.
This was a departure we'd made many, many times. There was nothing untoward, unusual about this.
Mike Putzel from AP shouted a question. And the press were, right off to our left, very close. And just, as a matter of habit, whether it had been Lynn Nofziger or Larry Speaks or Jim Brady, whoever was the assigned press person for the day, I just reached behind me and grabbed him and moved him in front of me to field the question so that I could get the president in the car.
We were walking and talking, and someone in the crowd yelled, "Hi, Mr. President." He turned around, as he always does, to wave. And that's when it started.
Mr. President! Back up! Get him out! Get him out! Get him out! Get him out! No!
The only reason that I knew that it was not a cap gun, that it was somebody shooting a pistol, was that I was so close to the shooter that I could smell the sulfur that was coming from the explosive.
I mean, I went in on top of the president. Actually, Shattuck and I gave him a tremendous heave into the back seat. He lit with his chest on the transmission riser, and his head hit the seat, and me on top of him. Shattuck immediately threw both of our feet in and slammed the door.
And the next thing I knew, I was down on the cement trying to crawl into a storm sewer and found I didn't fit.
Hinckley was swarmed by the Secret Service, disarmed and arrested. He was a disturbed drifter, prone to writing rambling love notes. Hinckley stood trial later in 1981 and was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He is confined to St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. to this day. Hinckley's attack was so sudden and unexpected, it took Parr a few minutes to realize the gravity of what had happened.
And as we move away with me in the back seat with the president and Drew Unruh driving, I see two things, which tells me and confirms that it's been an attack. That is the bullet hole in the window, which did not penetrate because it's armored glass, and 3 bodies lying on the sidewalk as we pull away from there. I'll never forget that sight as long as I live.
Press Secretary Jim Brady was nearly killed. D.C. police officer Thomas Delahunty and Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy were seriously wounded. Yet at first it seemed that President Reagan had escaped unharmed.
My first assumption was that we made it. It had been an attempt, but we had been successful. At first I said we were going to head back to the White House, which is the safest place. And we were speeding south on Connecticut Avenue, and I would say about DuPont Circle, where we went under DuPont Circle. The president brought a napkin out of his pocket. He started dabbing some blood that was on the inside of his mouth. He said, "I think that I cut the inside of my mouth when you came down on top of me, or my head hit the seat." And I took one look at that blood, which was bright, frothy, and one look at him, and it was either an educated or trained guess or pure intuition that we had some serious problems here. So I said, well, we're going to George Washington. And I stepped out and opened the door and looked at him, and the agents were taking their formations around him. And I looked down at him and put my hand out to help him out. He took it, and he said, "I'm walking in." And he walked in through the doors, about maybe 15 or 20 feet, and he dropped like a lead balloon. He was 200 pounds of just dead weight. Well, the shift and I and the nurses, and there was a couple of ambulance people, we picked him up and carried him to Trauma Room 5. And in that moment, I thought we had lost another president. Well, when he came to consciousness after about 30 or 40 seconds, he looked at me and he looked at what was happening. He was being manhandled pretty well. He said, "Well, I hope they're all Republicans." He said that several times that day, and one of the doctors said, "Well, today we're all Republicans, Mr. President." I felt pretty good at that sense of humor. I felt that he was still in a lot of trouble, but maybe he was going to make it.
Reagan, of course, did make it, as did McCarthy, Delahunty, and Brady. Reagan survived because at the scene of the shooting, the Secret Service agents performed their duties exactly as they're trained. As Reagan approaches his limousine, Parr is directly behind him, and Agent Tim McCarthy is between him and the crowd. As the shots ring out, McCarthy throws himself into the line of fire, taking a bullet through the abdomen.
Agents are trained to respond to any sound like that. And so basically what Tim McCarthy did was extend that open door for me to get the president behind. But I owe my life to him, because if you stop that film when the third shot is fired by John Hinckley, I either get it or the president gets it. McCarthy did what he was supposed to do that day. He put his flesh in front of the president.
Parr did his job too, which was to cover and evacuate the president.
Thank God for the service that trained us to respond the way we did. And this simple principle, I always say this, is to cover and evacuate, which in essence is deceptively easy to grasp. It's so easy to cover somebody and evacuate him. But when you think about the implications of it, it's costly beyond measure to embody. I mean, it takes a certain individual, and the service does that to people. It gets inside of them, becomes part of their invisible web of obligations, is the only way I can describe it. So that's what prevailed that particular day.
There were considerable changes after the assassination attempt. I mean, this was the first president that had ever been shot and lived.
What we learned from John Hinckley would curl your hair. We learned that he was out in the crowd stalking a president in 1980 in Dayton, Ohio. He's told us that somehow he got turned off, but it leads one to extrapolate that over the past 25, 30 years since John Kennedy, that the service probably has turned off a number of individuals simply by our presence. And that's the way we would like it. We would like to put up enough of a protective array around the president with enough totally dedicated people that somebody who else is totally dedicated would change their mind and walk away from it.
Nevertheless, enough incidents had occurred to warrant changes.
Well, the amount of time that the president would be in public, for instance, in open areas, was simply practically down to nothing. There would be canopies built so that he would never be seen exiting from a car, and nobody would ever be near him exiting for a car.
That included covering the now famous doorway at the Washington Hilton.
So now today the president arrives, they shut the doors. He gets out and walks in. It's a sad commentary on American life in a way.
Changes were also made at the president's house.
The biggest change was getting weapon detectors, magnetometers at the White House, which had been resisted for many, many years through other administrations, through the Nixon administration, Ford, and resisted because they didn't want to offend people who were walking into the White House. But as a matter of fact, I think we picked up in maybe a year or maybe a year and a half after the magnetometer operation came into operation, 1,200 weapons.
The murder of John Fitzgerald Kennedy marked the beginning of a violent 18-year era in presidential protection that culminated with the shooting of President Reagan in 1981.
Of course, it raised all of our consciousness to the notion that almost all of our attacks have been outside. John Kennedy killed outside. The two attacks on Ford outside, both at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco and Sacramento, where Larry Boondorf took the weapon away from Squeaky Fromme, the attack on Wallace, and this attack on the president. So all this made a sort of a package of 18 years, or from the death of John Kennedy to the wounding of President Reagan. It's sort of a very, very tough period in American history for agents and for the American people also.
Once a man is elected president, he receives Secret Service protection for life. It is ironic that most men will be protected far longer as former presidents than they were as president.
What you'll find is, as a candidate approaches nomination, as a candidate is elected and ultimately nominated, the direction of interest starts focusing on that individual, but not because of the individual so much as it is to the office.
One of the largest gatherings of Secret Service agents took place at Simi Valley, California, in November 1991. The event was the dedication of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. For the first time in history, 5 presidents, both former and current, came together at one location. Each had their own protective detail.
At the University of and they presented me with his.
Isn't that great?
I love it. I think it's great.
We saw your letter sweater too that Nancy saved 41 years.
Here we go.
Yeah.
We'll be back. Just so you know, here we are. And there was some wardrobe we passed of Nancy's.
Oh, I missed that. I'm looking back to see it.
Yeah,
The protective details assigned to each former president are far smaller than the active presidential detail, but are still designed to provide around-the-clock security for each man. These details are also less structured than the active presidential detail and are shaped to fit the specific lifestyle and needs of each man. The United States Secret Service is responsible for protecting our 2 most cherished commodities, our currency and our leaders.
One of the most significant factors that sets us apart from other agencies is the fact that we have dual responsibilities. We have criminal investigative responsibilities and we have protective responsibilities. Although they sound as though they're very different, and in many respects they are, they also complement one another.
Secret Secret Service forensic teams track the origin and flow of counterfeit currency. Aided by computerized fingerprint banks and the latest in high-tech hardware. The Secret Service also guards the White House, which, in addition to being the president's home, is also an office complex for several thousand workers.
I don't think many people comprehend the amount of planning that is necessary when you have a protectee traveling somewhere. For a foreign trip, for example, you could expect to spend 3 weeks of 18-hour days and still not have enough time in your own mind to get this protection together.
In May of 1994, President Clinton led a multinational group of dignitaries to Normandy, France, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of D-Day. Secret Service preparations began long before the departure of Air Force One. Presidential limousines and follow-up vehicles were prepared for their long overseas flight aboard special Air Force C-5 cargo planes. Among the Secret Service agents in Normandy in advance of the president was Special Agent in Charge, Pat Miller.
Pre-advance usually leaves about 30 days before the president's expected to depart. Once they're there, as far as the Secret Service is concerned, our agents on the President's detail will meet with the Secret Service agent in charge of our Paris field office. They will visit the sites and conduct some site security reviews.
Yeah, it's dumping off that same point there, so I'm going to need a few more guys up here. I'm going to knight one of my post standers to be the assistant at this site, but he can still probably use a hand. So we'll just play that by ear, and I'll look for you guys.
Going out, what you will buses be stacked out here?
Yeah, everything should remain right out here. This lot. Yeah, and it's a small lot.
The escorts we have will stay outside.
Yeah.
The staff is not quite sure of what the program for the president will be. They need some time to plan this. During that period of time, preliminarily, we set up our security perimeters, and we deal with the 3 perimeters: the outside perimeter, the middle perimeter, and the inner perimeter will be dealt with at a later time.
Working in close cooperation with the U.S. military, the outer security boundaries around the president are set. Problems arose at Utah Beach on D-Day. The weather along the Normandy coast turned stormy, and the high winds jeopardized the Secret Service plan to helicopter President Clinton to each of the ceremonies. Agents discussed the security ramifications of changing to auto transportation.
I don't know, but if you around us here, he'll come out outside the tent. And what the staff is after drop off.
And worked with the military to rearrange staging areas.
Our media buses.
All right.
Unaware of the backstage transportation crisis, thousands of guests continued to stream through the metal detector security checkposts manned by Secret Service personnel. Finally, the official change of plans was announced.
Details to work out on what are they going to do as far as are we going to leapfrog them? Are we going to leapfrog?
These contingency plans are developed to ensure that we provide the best possible security for the President of the United States and also try to keep him on time. because his business is based upon being on time at these locations. It's very important to him. And for the process. This didn't cause us any difficulty whatsoever, because this is just a thing that we do all the time.
President Clinton arrived on schedule, and the day's program went off without a hitch. The next day at Orly Airport in Paris, Secret Service personnel meet with French aviation officials to prepare for their trip home.
Once the event is over with and the protectee leaves, there's a great feeling of accomplishment that together as a group of people, as a team, that we made this thing work.
A giant transport plane prepares to carry automobiles, communications gear, and over 80 Secret Service agents back to Washington, D.C.
Our mission requires us to rely very much on one another. A tremendous amount of responsibility. You have to have tremendous confidence in the people that you work with. Everything that we do is a team effort. And that reliance on one another under pretty extraordinary circumstances sometimes creates, I think, a bond that translates into the family that we refer to as the Secret Service family.
Secret Service agents come in all shapes and sizes. And serve a variety of duties.
The mission's been accomplished. Protectee is safe. We're on to a new challenge.
In order to prepare themselves for any eventuality in the field, these men and women maintain an extraordinary level of physical fitness. At the Rowley Training Center in Beltsville, Maryland, agents are schooled in a number of areas.
By setting up our instructors in this fashion here, we're simulating what it might look like if we were to have the president approaching people for handshaking. We call it a rope line situation.
Hi, Mr. President, hi. Down.
Agents are trained in a much better fashion now than they were 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. The training is more realistic, it's more focused, it's more difficult.
Full-scale models of buildings and streets provide the backdrop for elaborate training exercises. As would-be counterfeiters and assassins become more and more sophisticated, the Secret Service must remain ever vigilant and keep abreast of all new technological advances.
I think the operative word that is going to drive the Secret Service, whether it's our meat and potatoes type counterfeit investigations through to the electronic crimes, which are very sophisticated type of investigations, is technology. And technology is driving law enforcement generally and the Secret Service specifically.
In a free society where access to our leaders is part of the democratic process, the need for and challenges of the Secret Service continues to grow. Today, there are over 2,000 agents stationed across the country, assigned to protect our national interests, our currency, and our president, the ultimate line of defense against those who would do us harm.
Whenever he needed help, whenever he had to be carried somewhere, or whenever he had to transfer from a wheelchair to the car, or whenever he had to be pulled to a standing position, that was always done behind the scenes. And the Secret Service would arrange that there would be a screen, that there would be a private room for the president to get ready.
And I jumped from the car and ran to the presidential car. Before I got there, he had been shot again in the head. And when I got to the car, Mrs. Kennedy was coming out on the back of the trunk of the car.
At the time, of all the people I'd been with, I thought we worked him as closely as almost humanly possible, as closely as anyone that I had ever protected.
Secret Service agent Larry Boondorf saw the hand, saw the gun, and grabbed the gun just before Squeaky Fromm was about to pull the trigger.
Well, what Tim McCarthy did was he embodied what every Secret Service agent hopes he will do if he has to, and that's take a bullet or shield the president with his own body.
The Secret Service is an organization that's been built on extraordinary efforts of people in our past, extraordinary patriotism, professionalism, dedication to duty, and there's an obligation for the people that are in the Secret Service now and that will be in the Secret Service in the future to uphold those high standards.
So how effective is the Secret Service? Compared to other democratic countries where security is seemingly minimal, countries like Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Canada, the U.S. record suffers. Among Western-style democracies, only Sweden has been through an assassination in recent years. But none of those governments has had to deal with such a volatile society. Every year, Americans generate about 20,000 threats, each of which has to be investigated by the Secret Service. So given a president's demand to be seen and be touched, given the impossibility of total security, given the American public's easy access to firearms, and given the incidence of violence in this country, it's a wonder that the record of the United States Secret Service is as good as it is. For the History Channel, I'm Roger Mudd. Thanks for watching. Hello, I'm Roger Mudd. Welcome to the History Channel. Not until 3 presidents had been assassinated, Lincoln in 1865, Garfield in 1881, McKinley in 1901, did the U.S. government give its chief executives professional and full-time protection. The assignment went to the United States Secret Service, an agency of the Treasury Department which had been approved at Lincoln's final cabinet meeting to fight counterfeiters. Our program is a rare view of one of the government's most closed agencies and of its agents who are so often portrayed in dark suits, dark glasses, talking into their sleeves. We begin with today's Secret Service planning security for a presidential trip, and then go back to the early days when the agents were tracking counterfeiters, not assassins. Join us now as the History Channel peels back some of the layers of secrecy that envelop this celebrated agency, the Secret Service.
Secret Service was given the job, and the new president, Teddy Roosevelt, became its first protectee. As America entered World War I, security precautions were heightened, and Secret Service protection was extended to cover the president's immediate family. In 1922, Secret Service duties were expanded by the creation of a special police force to protect the White House. The first real test of the effectiveness of Secret Service protection came in 1933, when President-elect Franklin Roosevelt escaped unharmed after a would-be assassin opened fire during a speech in Miami. While FDR's physical handicap made it much more difficult to protect him, the public's awareness was kept to a minimum thanks in large part to the efforts of the Secret Service.
The Secret Service closed the doors, and then they had a mattress on the floor, and they would lift the president out of the car like a floppy doll, plop him down on the mattress, strip his clothes off, rub him down with towels and wrap him in blankets and give him a shot of brandy, and then put him back in his clothes and lift him up and put him back in the car. And 10 minutes later, he was out again, waving to the crowds.
In 1950, the only Secret Service officer to be killed while protecting the president was gunned down by assassins waiting to shoot Harry Truman. 27 shots were fired in less than 2 minutes. Then it was all over. Officer Leslie Kofelt died within hours at a nearby hospital. On December 5th, 1950, he was buried at Arlington Cemetery with full military honors. In the long history of the Secret Service, only one man, Leslie Kofelt, has died while protecting the president. When Dwight Eisenhower became president, Congress ordered the Secret Service to begin protecting Vice President Richard Nixon. Agents were credited with saving Nixon's life when his motorcade was attacked during an overseas trip to Venezuela. In 1963, one of the most painful chapters in Secret Service history occurred when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. It was the first time a president had been killed while under Secret Service protection.
And then when we finally arrived in the Dealey Plaza area, the crowds were very sparse. And so I returned to the follow-up car, and we made a left-hand turn. And shortly after we made a left-hand turn, there was an explosion to my right rear. Sounded like a gunshot or a firecracker. And I jumped from the car and ran to the presidential car. Before I got there, he had been shot again in the head. And when I got to the car, Mrs. Kennedy was coming out on the back of the trunk of the car. It appeared to me that she was attempting to retrieve part of his head that had been blown off. I slipped when I first tried to get up on the car, and I had to take 2 or 3 more steps before I finally did get up on the car and helped put her back in her seat and laid across the top of she and the president.
In the wake of Kennedy's assassination, the Secret Service had little time to mourn as they were pressed to protect the new administration and the hundreds of foreign dignitaries who attended JFK's funeral. 5 years after John Kennedy's death, his brother Robert, a presidential contender in the California primary, was also assassinated. As a result, Congress extended Secret Service protection to presidential candidates and their spouses. In 1972, another presidential hopeful, George Wallace, was shot and paralyzed during an attack that nearly killed Secret Service agent Nick Zarbos.
At the time, of all the people I'd been with, I thought we worked him as closely as almost humanly possible, as closely as anyone that I had ever protected. I heard the first gunshot. I was looking a little to the left. When I heard the second or third gunshot, I started moving my head to the right, and at the same instant, I felt a burning sensation in my neck and knew that I'd been hit.
In 1975, President Gerald Ford became the target of 2 assassination attempts during a 17-day period. Both were thwarted by the Secret Service.
And as we got closer and closer to the steps of the state capitol, I went to shake a hand, and here was a hand that had a gun in it, and obviously the person was about to pull the trigger. And very fortunately, Secret Service agent Larry Boondorf saw the hand, saw the gun, and grabbed the gun just before Squeaky Fromm was about to pull the trigger.
And in 1981, the Secret Service was there again when John Hinckley opened fire.
Hinckley was less than 6 feet from me, and the barrel of the gun, tip of the gun was less than 5 feet from me. And what he was doing was shooting over my right shoulder.
President Ronald Reagan was wounded in the attack, but survived thanks to the brave actions of his Secret Service detail.
What Tim McCarthy did was he embodied what every Secret Service agent hopes he will do if he has to, and that's take a bullet or shield the president with his own body.
Today's Secret Service is one of the most respected law enforcement agencies in the world, with over 3,000 agents and uniformed officers investigating monetary crimes and protecting the president. But it started out as a very different organization. The present-day Secret Service was founded by the Treasury Department in 1865, just after the end of the Civil War. However, in the early days of that war, there briefly existed another Secret Service, a spy unit operating within the War Department. It was a ragtag collection of volunteers from throughout the northern states, recruited to perform a variety of daring espionage duties behind enemy lines in the South. From this modest headquarters building, some of the most exciting exploits of the Civil War were planned, along with some of the dirtiest tricks. For example, Southern officers were frequently kidnapped and brought north to be freed in exchange for Union soldiers being held in Confederate prison camps. Mail coming in and out of Richmond was routinely opened, read, and resealed by these cheeky spies, providing priceless information on Confederate troop movements. Among the famous individuals who became part of the old Secret Service were Allan Pinkerton, who would go on to found the legendary Security and Detective Service, and William P. Wood, who personally led raids on Confederate riverboats deep in rebel territory and became the first chief of the revamped Secret Service in 1865. The American public never knew about this notorious unit until after the war, but its existence was no secret to government officials in Washington. Congressmen would regularly visit the Secret Service campsites and rub elbows with General Pinkerton and others. Waging the Civil War was a huge financial undertaking. The cost of outfitting troops, arming them, and housing them was costing the federal government almost $500 million per year, a sum equal to about $50 billion today. However, this was one time when there would be no debate on expenditures. A Confederate victory would have meant the end of the United States of America, and no one could possibly put a price tag on that. In 1862, the U.S. Treasury fought to control a banking system over which it had very little authority. There was no central bank, and each state had the power to issue currency. As a result, over 1,600 financial institutions around the country were printing money. The value of this money varied greatly from city to city. Since it was impossible to determine if a distant bank was solvent, merchants rarely honored paper currency at full face value, if they honored it at all. Most Americans during this period were skeptical about paper currency and hoarded their coins, resulting in chronic shortages.
And because these banks were chartered by the states, you could pay off a state legislator, you could open up your own bank and start printing currency that literally was not worth the paper that it was printed on. And so consequently there was no real confidence. The only money that was exchanging hand was the content, the gold and silver coins.
To alleviate the problem, state banks began printing fractional paper currency for amounts as low as just a few pennies. President Lincoln and his cabinet were shocked to find that by 1862, over half the money being circulated in the United States was not genuine. Lack of federal control made counterfeiting one of the easiest and popular crimes in the country. Congress took strong measures in 1863 by authorizing both a central bank and a single currency, the greenback, which was supposed to be impossible to counterfeit. Now that counterfeiters had only one currency to duplicate rather than 1,600 different ones, bogus greenbacks soon flooded the marketplace.
People weren't really sure of what they had. The counterfeiters were going all out, and it was estimated that somewhere around 30% or more, maybe a third of our currency was counterfeit at the time.
The federal government was still facing a financial crisis, but the task of winning the war was its first and foremost priority. With the surrender of Confederate forces in the spring of 1865, Treasury Secretary Hugh McCulloch was able to direct his full attention to the counterfeiting problem. He devised a plan for an elite law enforcement unit to be administered by the Department of the Treasury and took his idea directly to the President. On April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was in an unusually upbeat mood. The South had surrendered just 5 days earlier, and Washington was still celebrating. Late that afternoon, Secretary McCulloch got the President to approve the creation of the new Secret Service. It was the last official action that Mr. Lincoln took before leaving for the theater that night. April 14, 1865 was referred to as the 5th day of peace, marking the 5th day since General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Among the celebrations taking place that day around the country was the re-raising of the Stars and Stripes over Fort Sumter, where the Civil War began. In Washington, the soldiers who were standing guard the previous week now marched in victory parades. With the return to peace, President Lincoln lost his full-time military bodyguards and had no organized protection of any consequence. The President and Mrs. Lincoln accepted a last-minute invitation from Ford's Theater to attend a performance of Our American Cousin that evening, which also happened to be Good Friday. The popular comedy, starring well-known actress Laura Keene, would provide a welcome evening of light entertainment for the First family. April 14th, 1865. Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C. There was no organized protection. Joining Mr. Lincoln in the presidential box were First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, Major Henry Rathbone, an officer assigned to the president, and Miss Clara Harris, his fiancée. Waiting outside the door was John Wilkes Booth. Unbeknown to the audience, a band of conspirators was already at work. A group of Southern sympathizers, led by the well-known actor John Wilkes Booth, was planning to assassinate the president and most of his cabinet before the night was over. Booth had already carved a peephole in the door of the presidential box and timed his attack to coincide with a burst of laughter from the audience. Shortly after 10:30, Booth struck. Storming into the presidential box, Booth fired a single gunshot into Lincoln's head. The president lunged forward, threw up his arms, and collapsed onto Mrs. Lincoln. Booth dropped the pistol and brandished a shiny dagger with which he attacked Major Rathbone. Leaping from the box to the stage below, the crazed assassin caught his spur in the bunting and broke his leg. Before a panic-stricken audience, Booth shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," "Thus shall it ever be for tyrants," before escaping by a rear door. Taking the reins of his waiting horse, Booth sped off into the night. At the same time, several blocks away, another bizarre attack was underway. Secretary of State William Henry Seward was recuperating from a recent accident at his home and was attended by his young daughter. The bedridden cabinet member was visited by a large young man who purported to be delivering medicine. Upon entering the house, the delivery man ran up to Mr. Seward's bedroom and fired a pistol at him. The gun failed to go off, and the assailant began to viciously stab the man several times before being routed out of the house. Back at Ford's Theater, doctors in the audience rushed to help the president, but all realized that his wounds were fatal. A makeshift procession was assembled to take Mr. Lincoln from the theater to a boarding house across the street where the death watch began. As members of government and family streamed in and out, attending doctors could do little but change the blood-soaked pillow under the president's wounded head. At 7:22 on the morning of April 15th, Abraham Lincoln died, the 16th President of the United States and the first one to be assassinated. Less than 3 hours later, Vice President Andrew Johnson was sworn in as the new president. However, the real power in Washington, D.C. was centered at the War Department. Secretary Edwin M. Stanton took over the reins of government and used every means at his disposal to find the men responsible for the attacks on the president and Secretary Seward. Successfully avoiding the military troops surrounding Washington, D.C., Booth made it into Maryland, where he rendezvoused with David Herold, one of his conspirators. Their getaway plans were delayed due to Booth's injured leg. Dr. Samuel Mudd, a nearby physician, was awakened by the pair, and he set the broken leg. Booth and Herold resumed their flight and crossed the Potomac into the state of Virginia. For 12 days, they lived like animals while being pursued by Union soldiers. The pair was finally tracked to a barn in Port Royal, Virginia. The surrounding troops were instructed to return Booth to Washington, D.C. alive. However, an overzealous sergeant fired and killed him. During this time, funeral plans were being made for Abraham Lincoln. In addition to a full state funeral in Washington, the body would travel to a dozen cities across the country that also planned elaborate funeral services. After 20 days, Mr. Lincoln was finally put to rest in Springfield, Illinois. The hunt for assassination conspirators began in earnest, and hundreds of individuals were ultimately arrested. Finally, 8 individuals were ordered to stand trial before a military commission. The defendants were all housed in the Capitol Penitentiary, where they were forced to wear heavy canvas isolation hoods. After a speedy trial, all of the defendants were found guilty. 4 of the conspirators who aided in Booth's escape, Michael O'Loughlin, Edward Spangler, Sam Arnold, and the infamous Dr. Mudd, were given prison terms. Lewis Payne, the man who attacked Secretary of State Seward, George Atzerodt, who was supposed to murder Secretary Stanton but lost his nerve, David Herold, the retarded man arrested in the company of Booth, and Mrs. Mary Surratt, who ran the Washington, D.C. boarding house where the conspiracy was planned, were all sentenced to death. On July 7th, 1865, a blistering hot day, press and spectators gathered at the prison to witness the hangings of the 4 conspirators. Over the objections of the families, the corpses became government property and were quickly buried next to the gallows. After the initial public outcry over the death of President Lincoln, public opinion quickly subsided and no security measures were taken to protect the President of the United States. After all, something this horrible could never happen again. The newly formed Secret Service aggressively sought out counterfeiters. And in 1866, gained notoriety for capturing William Brockway, a famous counterfeiter who was copying and circulating bogus U.S. Treasury bonds. 16 years after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield was sworn in as the 20th president in 1881. Garfield was a celebrated war hero who had bold plans to revitalize the highest office in the land and streamline the rapidly expanding federal government. However, these plans came to an end at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington on July 2nd, while the president waited for a train. July 2nd, 1881. Baltimore and Potomac Station, Washington, D.C. There was no organized protection. Mr. Garfield was chatting with several of his advisors, while Charles Guiteau waited for the crowd to disperse. The lone man quietly approached the president, produced a gun, and promptly shot him at close range in the back. Panic ensued, but the assailant was captured. The president's wounds were serious, but not immediately fatal. He returned to the White House to convalesce, but Mr. Garfield began to fall prey to infections from the bullet that was still lodged in his abdomen. His condition began to deteriorate rapidly. The noted inventor Alexander Graham Bell was even called in to probe the dying president with an experimental electric metal detector designed to find the assassin's bullet. Unfortunately, it proved useless. In a last-ditch attempt to save him, doctors moved President Garfield to his seaside home in New Jersey. However, nothing worked, and James Garfield died on September 19th, less than 6 months into his term of office. Garfield's assassin was identified as Charles Guiteau, an unstable individual with delusions of grandeur. Unlike the Lincoln conspirators, he was tried in a civilian court in Washington and found guilty of murder. Tickets to his execution the following spring were highly sought after, and Guiteau went to the gallows reciting nonsensical poetry. While the nation mourned the loss of James Garfield, it did not feel the same sense of loss that surrounded Lincoln's death. Unbelievably, after 2 murders in 16 years, the President of the United States was still not being protected on a full-time basis. In the wake of the Garfield assassination, the Secret Service was preoccupied with protecting the United States currency. However, additional responsibilities were being added.
Insofar as investigations, there were no other agencies or bureaus that had investigative responsibilities. And so consequently, any department that would provide allocations for reimbursement to the Treasury Department to pay for the Secret Service could essentially enjoy those services. And the Secret Service was tasked to investigate a number of things that you would not normally relate to the Secret Service.
One of these was the investigation of the violence surrounding Ku Klux Klan rallies throughout the South. The success of this investigation greatly enhanced the stature of the Secret Service.
It wasn't until the Cleveland administration that the Secret Service was approached to provide protection. And curious enough, it wasn't for the president himself, but rather for his family and his children.
In 1894, Mrs. Cleveland was made aware of kidnapping threats targeted at her children, especially the youngest daughter, Ruth, who the press nicknamed Baby Ruth, and who became the inspiration for a popular candy bar. Without consulting the president, the First Lady asked if the Secret Service could keep an eye on the family while they vacationed in Massachusetts. Chief William P. Hazen complied, paying for the security detail out of counterfeiting funds. He was promptly fired. With the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898, President William McKinley received round-the-clock protection, but from the Army, not the Secret Service. McKinley lost his military protection with the end of the war. Moving into the 20th century, the United States had much to celebrate. The war with Spain was won, the country was emerging as a world leader, and our economy was booming. William McKinley was a popular and beloved president. In the fall of 1901, the Pan American Exposition opened in Buffalo, New York. It was a showplace of new ideas in technology and an international tourist attraction. On September 6th, President McKinley traveled to Buffalo for a major speech. Afterwards, he stood in a long receiving line to shake hands with the crowd.
Most people don't realize that President McKinley had Secret Service operatives with him. I don't know if they were referred to as agents, but there was a Secret Service presence. But it was more of a staff function. They were there to make sure that the crowd was able to get through to meet the president. They weren't there to protect him because, again, there was no legislation, nor were there any appropriations that would allow us to provide protection for the president.
September 6th, 1901. The Pan American Exposition at Buffalo, New York. There was no organized protection. President McKinley insisted upon shaking everyone's hand. Leon Czolgosz waited patiently in line for his turn. With a napkin draped over his hand, Czolgosz approached the president. But instead of shaking hands, he fired a gun at point-blank range. William McKinley was dead. The nation was stunned and began a protracted period of mourning. The advent of motion pictures and telephones made the details of McKinley's state funeral available to almost everyone. It was the biggest event in the history of the nation's capital and was called the first media event of the 20th century. The assassin had a history of aberrant behavior and was a member of the anarchist political movement. He was universally despised. Czolgosz was brought to trial just 4 days after McKinley's funeral. In less than 9.5 hours, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The deep-seated public resentment toward Czolgosz is evident in this letter from Albert Gallagher, one of the Secret Service operatives present at the assassination, who seeks permission to witness the execution. This rare footage, shot under the supervision of Thomas Edison himself, shows the electrocution of Czolgosz. Authorities were so nervous that the body of Czolgosz might serve as a symbol for the anarchist political movement that they ordered his coffin flooded with a powerful acid solution. Within hours, his remains were turned to liquid. This time, public sentiment brought about action. The Secret Service was ordered to begin round-the-clock protection of Theodore Roosevelt. President Roosevelt had a reputation as a rugged individualist and a macho outdoorsman. However, when it came to accepting protection from the Secret Service, he was very cooperative and heeded their advice. In fact, he took great pains to publicly showcase the presence of his newly installed guards. Upon his victory in 1912, Woodrow Wilson became the first president-elect to receive protection from the Secret Service. The size of the Secret Service Presidential Protective Detail increased. Among the new hires was Colonel Edmund Starling, who would become as legendary as the men he protected. The soft-spoken Kentucky gentleman quickly rose through the ranks and became head of the White House detail. With the start of the Great War in 1914, tensions heightened in the United States, and the number of threats to the president dramatically increased. Colonel Starling and the rest of the agents kept an ever-watchful eye on Mr. Wilson. By 1915, the Secret Service was responsible for investigating all neutrality violations by foreign countries in the United States. Among the plots uncovered was a German scheme to corner the market for liquid chlorine, the key ingredient in poisonous mustard gas that was in wide use at the time. As America entered the war in 1917, the Secret Service broadened its protection of the president to include his immediate family. At war's end in 1918, President Wilson made history by journeying to France to participate in the peace negotiations, and Colonel Starling became a legend.
While he was with President Wilson in France, he was traveling in a car behind the President of France, Georges Clemenceau. And while he was traveling along the motorcade route, he witnessed an assassin level his revolver at the French president. And one of the things that Colonel Starling was legend was his shooting ability. And he drew his service weapon and fired at the assassin and shot him right in the hand just as he was getting ready to let go with his shot. And I'm happy to report that the only casualty was the French president's hat. And Colonel Starling was a big celebrity in France, and he was asked to help instruct the Invisible Service, which was the French Secret Service at the time, who provided protection to the French president. So he was unusual in that he was well known to the American public, as opposed to today, where we tend to operate in the background, and we prefer it that way.
In 1921, Warren Harding succeeded Woodrow Wilson as president. Little changed with the Secret Service at this time, and Colonel Starling presided over a calm and tranquil White House. To complement the work of the Secret Service, a special White House police force was created. This force grew rapidly in stature and numbers. In 1923, the country was shocked by the sudden death of President Harding, who was traveling in California. Vice President Calvin Coolidge was promptly sworn in as president, and it was business as usual for the Secret Service. A year later, the United States Senate took the unusual act of bringing the Secret Service into its investigation of illegal oil field leases at Teapot Dome, Wyoming. Making extensive use of telegraph correspondence, Secret Service agents proved that Interior Secretary Albert B. Fall defrauded the federal government. The country soon recovered from this shocking scandal and kept cool with Coolidge. President Coolidge served the remainder of his term, but chose not to run again in 1928. Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover, one of the most respected men of his day, won his party's nomination and the White House that year. Colonel Starling and the rest of the White House detail looked on as Mr. Hoover took office in 1929 with great expectations. These expectations evaporated within months with the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. To make matters worse, a fire broke out in the White House on Christmas Eve, 1929. If not for the White House police, the building might have been lost. As the Great Depression reached its darkest hour in 1932, the number of threats against Mr. Hoover reached new highs, and public demonstrations against the president began to appear, a new phenomenon. The job of the Secret Service details surrounding President Hoover became much more complicated. For the first time in history, agents had to protect the president from the American public. Nothing Herbert Hoover did seemed to help the economy, and in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic governor of New York, won the presidential election by a landslide. Unbeknown to most Americans, FDR was a victim of polio who was confined to a wheelchair and could not walk under his own power.
Roosevelt was an ambitious young man in a hurry, and he ran as vice president on the Democratic ticket in 1920, and he did very well. The ticket lost, but he obtained national recognition. He was a Roosevelt. His cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, had been a very popular president. Franklin wanted to be president. Franklin came down with polio, a severe case of paralytic polio. And for 7 years, he had to drop out of active politics. So anytime you ever saw Franklin Roosevelt, he was standing in a posed position. He worked out a way of walking several feet. He couldn't walk more than 40, 50 feet. With long leg braces and a pelvic band to keep his hips from buckling, and with a cane, and which he would use as a crutch, a load-bearing crutch, and the arm of a strong man. He could not have been elected if people had known how paralyzed he was. Once he was elected to the White House, he had the Secret Service to help him. And I've always said, if you're going to be in a wheelchair, you know, it's nothing nicer than having the Secret Service advancing for you. Because wherever FDR went, he went in a ramped environment. Sometimes they had to do quite remarkable things. One time when Speaker of the House Bankhead died and Roosevelt went to the funeral in Alabama, there were steps up to the front of the church. And so in order to avoid the president being carried up those steps, the Secret Service simply ramped the whole street. The entire level of the street was raised, so that everyone going to the funeral was raised on the level of the church.
In 1933, before assuming his duties as president, Roosevelt embarked on a Caribbean fishing cruise that ended in Miami. The president-elect decided to informally address the local community with an outdoor speech. February 15th, 1933. Bayside Park in Miami. Secret Service agents are joined by Miami police officers. FDR was seated in the back of an open touring car and was joined by Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago. Giuseppe Zangara was positioning himself in the crowd. Arriving at Bayside Park on the evening of February 15th, 1933, Mr. Roosevelt was under the strict protection of the Secret Service. While speaking to the crowd, a deranged gunman got within 35 feet of the parked presidential car and fired 5 shots.
Suddenly, shots ring out. A woman screams. The thousands who had gathered to hail Roosevelt become a hysterical mass as legionnaires and Secret Service men converge on the would-be assassin.
Each of the bullets hit someone, but not President Roosevelt.
Chicago's Mayor Cermak, hit by the bullets that were meant for the president-elect, is critically wounded and is carried to the Roosevelt car, which rushes him off to the hospital.
The rest of the shots hit innocent bystanders, but none was seriously injured.
Almost on the heels of the car come the Secret Service men who have captured Joe Zangara, whose aim was deflected so that he missed Roosevelt, but hit Mayor Cermak instead. Zangara is pinioned to the back of an official car by government men and hastily driven off to custody.
Many credit Mrs. Lillian Cross with saving the life of Mr. Roosevelt. Her tugging on the arm of the gunman probably prevented him from getting a clean shot.
My first thought was to get it. I knew he was shooting at the president, so my first thought was to get the pistol up in the air so he wouldn't shoot any of the bystanders. When the first shot was fired, I realized he was shooting at someone, and I taken my right arm and pushed the pistol up just as hard as I could. And the gentleman beside of me pushed it up, helped me push it up.
The assassin was an unemployed Italian immigrant bricklayer named Giuseppe Zangara, who pleaded guilty to local authorities. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. On March 4th, 1933, the reins of government passed from Herbert Hoover to Franklin Roosevelt. An eager nation anxiously awaited to hear from its new president.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
At the first inaugural, when Roosevelt gave the speech that electrified the nation, which was in the deep Great Depression, and Roosevelt said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," Roosevelt walked to the podium to give that speech. And according to Secret Service records, he walked 37 paces. They had measured the distance. They had it all planned.
2 days later, Mayor Cermak died of his wounds. Zangara was retried for murder and sentenced to death. On March 20th, 33 days after the shooting, he was electrocuted. But the Secret Service had done its job, and Franklin Roosevelt went on to take his place in history.
Since 1901, the role of the U.S. Secret Service has steadily expanded from guarding just the president to guarding the president-elect and the vice president and the vice president-elect and ex-presidents and the widows and minor children of ex-presidents, and finally to all major presidential and vice presidential campaigners. By 1972, 11 presidential candidates qualified for protection, and there were complaints that the Secret Service had become a barrier between the politicians and the public. Our next program goes inside the White House during wartime, when potential assassins included foreign agents and terrorists.
For proximity to the large number of people on that side of the street. And I'd gotten up and down from the car 3 or 4 times.
It was confining, but there was nothing really wrong about it except, you know, the smell of motorcycles and cars.
The Kennedys rode in a lead car with Governor and Mrs. Connolly, followed by the Secret Service follow-up car, then Vice President Johnson's car.
And I was seated in the front seat on the opposite side from the driver, right in front of LBJ.
November 22nd, 1963, Dealey Plaza, Dallas. Secret Service agents are joined by Texas state troopers and Dallas police officers. President Kennedy was seated in his customary spot in the motorcade. Agent Clint Hill was stationed in the follow-up car behind the president. Vice President Johnson was 2 cars back from the president. Agent Rufus Youngblood was seated directly in front of the vice president, while Lee Harvey Oswald waited in his sniper's nest. Agents Hill and Youngblood both believed that Oswald was the lone gunman that day.
And then when we finally arrived in the Dealey Plaza area, the crowds were very sparse. And so I returned to the follow-up car, and we made a left-hand turn, and shortly after we made a left-hand turn, there was an explosion to my right rear. Sounded either like a gunshot or a firecracker. And I responded by looking to my right, and as I did so, my eyes went across the back of the presidential car. And I saw the president grab at his throat and lurch to the left. And I jumped from the car and ran to the presidential car. Before I got there, he had been shot again in the head. And when I got to the car, Mrs. Kennedy was coming out on the back of the trunk of the car. It appeared to me that she was attempting to retrieve part of his head that had been blown off. I slipped when I first tried to get up on the car, and I had to take 2 or 3 more steps before I finally did get up on the car and helped put her back in her seat and laid across the top of she and the president. We went on to the hospital, and when we got there, pulled into the emergency room, I noticed that the governor, his chest was all covered with blood. I had not realized that he had been hit. And so we had to get him out of the jump seats and onto a stretcher and into the emergency room before we could get the president out of the back seat of the car. And by that time, Mrs. Kennedy wouldn't let go of the president. And I realized that she didn't want anybody to see what was going on because part of his head had been blown off. And so I took my coat off, and we placed it over him and put him on the stretcher and rushed him into the emergency room.
As the first shot rang out, Youngblood covered Vice President Johnson.
I turned in my seat and hit him on the shoulder and hollered, "Get down." And then I got back on top of him. We proceeded to the hospital. And I told the vice president, when we were going to the hospital that, well, it is certainly an emergency situation, and I'm going to just stick with you like glue. As soon as we got to the hospital, we started in, and I had the assistance of some of these other agents, and we went into a private room, and I had them pull down all the shades and post an agent at the door, you know. And no one comes in here unless you know who it is and what his reason for being here.
Shortly thereafter, President Kennedy died. Like the rest of America, Rufus Youngblood was asking himself just what was going on.
We didn't know what had happened. We didn't know whether somebody had come around the corner with a machine gun and be shooting. We didn't know whether it was a conspiracy. We didn't know what was happening. So if you don't know, you prepare for everything. And, you know, I told him we should get out of there and get on the plane and get back to Washington and get in the White House. And he said, well, we'll leave here, but we'll wait on the plane for Mrs. Kennedy.
The Secret Service's first priority was to get Lyndon Johnson safely out of town.
I had sent Lim Johns, who was working with me, I'd sent him out to line up a car and get a driver that really knows the way and all the secrets and routes and everything. So he went out and he got Chief Curry, the police chief of Dallas, and we got in.
For 62 years, the Secret Service kept 9 presidents and their families out of harm's way. But in Dallas in 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald penetrated the protective cocoon. Our program tells the story of the Secret Service during one of the most turbulent and violent eras in American history, when every year seemed to bring more riots, demonstrations, and assassinations. The Secret Service is usually just that, secret. But on our broadcast, former agents talk candidly about those tumultuous years. One was assigned to the Kennedy motorcade in Dallas. Join us now for a rare inside look at the United States Secret Service.
Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy is on a trip to mend political fences in Texas. Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood was assigned to guard Vice President Lyndon Johnson.
We got off the plane. Air Force Two landed first ahead of the president because we had a lot of press people and all that on it. And then when the president's plane arrived, we met and greeted the president and Mrs. Kennedy.
Secret Service agent Clint Hill was responsible for protecting Mrs. Kennedy that day in Dallas.
The motorcade left the airport after a pretty good-sized crowd at the airport. Went on into the city of Dallas, through the streets of Dallas, where there were crowds periodically along the way. It wasn't solid everywhere, but it was apparent, but, you know, crowds here and there. And we got in the downtown section of Dallas. It became much more crowded.
It had been raining earlier that morning in Fort Worth, it cleared up, and it just turned out to look like a nice day, a nice crowd.
And the streets were crowded enough so that the motorcycles were having a difficult time remaining alongside the presidential car on the left-hand side of the street, because the driver of the presidential car was keeping the car farther to the left-hand side of the street to keep the president away from the crowd, which presented a problem for me because I was responsible for Mrs. Kennedy, and I had to get up on the back of the car periodically to be closer to her to try to prevent anything from happening because of
our house. So I was on the radio a lot, making arrangements and all to have security provided at his residence, the Elms. It was a hectic day. I don't think I got home till about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I didn't break down until then. I got home and I got to talking to Peggy, and man, I almost fell apart.
Even before the night was out, a bond developed between Youngblood and Lyndon Johnson that would continue throughout both men's careers. The days following the death of John F. Kennedy have become an unforgettable part of America's collective memory. As the Secret Service secured the area around the casket of John Kennedy in the Capitol, another bizarre event had transpired in Dallas. Lee Harvey Oswald, in the custody of the Dallas police, was shot while being transferred from one jail to another.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
Kennedy's accused assassin was rushed to Parkland Hospital, where President Kennedy himself had been taken 2 days earlier. It was there that Lee Harvey Oswald died. The Kennedy state funeral required the services of every Secret Service agent and officer available. Never before had the service been responsible for such a mammoth event, but these were extraordinary circumstances.
Chief Curry's car, you know, we killed the sirens, but we did have a motorcycle escort, and we went on back to the airport. And I had told him as soon as we stop and get out, and let's run up the ramp, no delays. And, you know, as soon as we got on the plane, I said, pull down all the shades, and I told him not to sit next to the window.
The Dallas Police Department wanted to hold John Kennedy's body for an autopsy. However, the Kennedy family prevailed, and the casket was soon loaded onto Air Force One.
He talked to Bobby Kennedy, and it was decided to get federal Judge Sarah Hughes to come out and administer the oath. Well, there was a lot of sobs and throats and, you know, lumps in the throat and sobs and all that on the airplane coming back.
That evening, Air Force One arrived back in Washington. President Kennedy's coffin was removed by a hastily arranged honor guard. The president's body was placed in a hearse as Clint Hill assisted Mrs. Kennedy. Then President Johnson, assisted by Rufus Youngblood, deplaned. The new president made his first public statement on the tarmac.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God.
He went to his office that night. He had an office in the EOB, which was part of the White House complex. But he did not go into the presidential office in the White House. He met people, had people coming and going, wrote some memos and all that stuff.
One of Lyndon Johnson's first presidential decisions was to remain in his own home in Bethesda, Maryland, called the Elms.
And he said, you know, we're not moving into the White House. We're going to